Hey, what's up you guys, the Curious Owl here, and today I will be sharing with you guys my August and September wrap-up. So it's been a little while since I've actually done a formal sit-down video because the last couple months have been really crazy. You guys will probably know that in August, I think it was, I basically decided to take a little bit of a break where I was only going to be putting out videos that I felt comfortable making, which for the most part have basically been reading, vlog, review kind of style, because those are the only things I feel like I'm able to make right now. I had basically a huge creative slump that hit, and with the stress of the wedding coming up, a lot of things were happening all at once that it was really hard for me to find time to spend on my channel. And so that's kind of why a lot of the videos I have put out recently have been kind of those reading vlog reviews, because they're kind of the easiest to film, and usually if I can take away like an hour or two during the day, I can sit and edit those and then get them uploaded like the next day. Like, they're a lot easier to make, I think, than most other sit down videos. So that was the easiest way for me to go about it. But things are starting to look a little up right now, because now we're in October and I get married at the end of the month. And then November is going to still be a little crazy because we'll be going on our honeymoon, and then also that month there's Thanksgiving and Black Friday and the holidays are coming up. So once I think we really get through November, things are going to be a lot easier because I'm not going to have nearly as much on my plate. So hopefully I will have some inspiration to get back to making videos. I don't know if I might do Vlogmas or anything. I don't think I will, but at the very least I may do some kind of bulk filming of videos over the course of Vlogmas to have ready to put up. But I don't know. We're going to have to see how things shake out, because basically by the end of November, I'll have a pretty good idea of how I want things to go. So without further ado then, let's get into the things that I read in August and September. It's going to be a long one, so grab a snack, grab a drink. We're going to get into this. I will also be having videos linked in the cards here and in the description for ones I did specifically reading vlogs and reviews on, because I don't want to go too much into them since I have done videos for them. So when I come up to those, I'll let you know, and then you can go check those videos out individually if you choose to. But there's just so many books I feel like I want to get through. It's not really a lot, but there's enough that I want to get through that I don't feel like I want to spend a lot of time talking about every single one. But first, let's get through August. So in August, I read a total of 6 books, or worked through a total of 6 books. My stats for that month were that I had read 1,690 pages and listened to a total of 28 hours, 39 minutes, and 14 seconds worth of audiobooks. I read 2 physical books, 1 ebook, 2 audiobooks, and 2 books were off of my personal TBR that I have currently, and 3 of them were borrowed. Stats for that month regarding star ratings were that I had 1 5-star book, 3 4-star books, and 1 3-star book, and then I actually did end up DNFing 1 book over that month. So the first book I ended up reading was Blanca and Roja by Anna Marie McLemore. This is my very first Anna Marie McLemore book, and I wasn't necessarily disappointed. I just feel like this may not have been, the story for me. I really loved a lot of the themes that were going with it about family and sisters, and kind of like willing to sacrifice yourself for the other person and being kind of selfless kind of thing. This story follows 2 sisters named Blanca and Roja, who basically come from a line of witches where the females typically, once they hit a certain age, have to basically not necessarily fight to the death, but they have to basically put themselves in the grace of these swans in order to remain human. Otherwise, they turn into a swan and are never seen again. This is very reminiscent of Practical Magic for those of you that may know that movie, because it's kind of got the same element of the curse, and it deals with the women of the family, that kind of thing. So it always ends up being one of the female siblings, and it does not matter how many boys are in a family, there always will be at least one girl, and usually one of those girls, if there are more than one, will end up becoming a swan. And the story is basically following these 2 sisters who are trying to kind of break that curse in a sense, but they're also trying to sacrifice themselves for the other person so that the other sister can live a normal life for the most part. Now, the town that they live in also does kind of know there's some kind of weird stuff happening with this family. They know that there's been a lot of missing people within the family that nobody knows anything about. And so the town kind of views this particular family as witch-like. They don't know necessarily if they are witches, but they do seem to have a lot of things about them that make them seem like they're witches, and so the whole town believes that they are. The story does involve two men also in the story, two young boys, I should say. They're kind of like older teenagers that both individually fall in love with one of the girls. One character is a trans man, and he is considered to be kind of like an outcast because of the fact that he's trans. There's a lot of talk about self-exploration really in this novel, and I really liked it, but the more that I try to think about it now, having been away from it for about 2 months, the less I seem to remember. And I think that's a testament to the kind of the story that this is. This is a story where like you get sucked in very easily as you're reading it. It is one of those stories where the writing is very flowery, it's very lyrical, it's beautiful prose, and there are some really great lines within the story about sisterhood and things of that nature and family, but there wasn't a lot of substance, I thought, to it. I kind of felt like it was just meh. I thought at times too the flowery writing was a little distracting from the story. I felt like I spent more time trying to decipher what the phrases were saying as opposed to understanding the story, and I felt like there also was a lot of miscommunication that could have easily been avoided on the part of Blanca, who is basically trying to sacrifice herself because Roja, her sister, is considered the bad egg, and everyone thinks that Roja is going to be the one that's going to be taken by the swans because she's considered the bad egg. She's got a fiery temper, she doesn't take no for an answer, those kinds of things, whereas Blanca is kind of the goody two-shoes of the sisters, and she thinks that basically she wants to sacrifice herself in order to save Roja because Roja deserves a better life. But there's a lot of miscommunication between the sisters in terms of like a lot of like their conversations, where I feel like if they really just sat down and talked, they would have really, explored a lot more about themselves and about each other. But they almost were so stubborn that they didn't even give each other the chance to be able to talk to each other. And a lot of Roja's resentment that she has in the story is because Blanca doesn't seem to really pay attention to her. And I feel like that could have easily been resolved. But otherwise, I think the story was pretty okay. It definitely was not my most favorite story of all time, but I do think it would be something I think I would go back and reread because I would like to possibly explore that whole story a little more in depth and maybe annotate it a little bit more to where I think I could, enjoy the story possibly more than the first time I read it. So it's not bad, but I don't think it sat well with me through the reading of it for the first time. Next book I read that I ended up DNFing was The Nebuly Coat by J. Mead Faulkner. This was my library lottery pick for the month of August, and it's a classic work, and it's supposed to follow this man who goes to this mansion. He's looking to restore a part of the mansion that kind of has been decrepit, it's kind of fallen apart, and while he's there, he finds this coat of arms that apparently has some kind of importance, and it's kind of like a historical fiction story about restoration, a lot of these different things about history and the importance of maintaining history and things of that nature. I couldn't get behind the language. I felt like I was very confused throughout the very beginning of it, and truthfully, it was very boring. I don't know necessarily what it was about it. I think it had something to do with the language and the pacing of the story. I just found it to be very slow and boring that about probably 20% in the way through the book, I was just not interested anymore, and I just decided to table it. The next book I read was The Wrath in the Dawn by Renee Ahdieh, the first book in the Wrath in the Dawn duology, and this I ended up giving a 4 to 5 stars. For those of you that may not know anything about this is basically a retelling of the 1001 Arabian Nights, which if you guys haven't know anything about it, it's kind of the original story of where the story of Aladdin came from, in a sense. It's not necessarily the same as what the Disney version is, but there is a version of the story that is like Aladdin. This, though, follows a young woman who decides to basically get herself married to the crown prince because she is looking to murder him. The reason she wants to murder him is because this prince has married several women over the course of several days, and each morning he ends up actually killing the bride because there is some kind of weird curse that he has to uphold, and she doesn't know really anything about it, but all she knows is that one of her dear friends went to marry the prince, and then the next day they found out she was dead. And it's a lot about revenge, and also, though, it's a lot about understanding that some things may not be as they seem. I really liked this. I thought that it was actually a really interesting story. The story is divvied up between Khalid, who is the prince who is dealing with this curse that has been thrust upon him that he has to try to uphold, and then there is Shahrazad, I think that's how you say her name, who is the female character, and it's all about her finding her strength and being able to go through with this plan that she has basically cooked up in her head. And there's all kinds of other twists and turns in terms of other characters that are involved with the story and how they play into the entirety of the story itself. But what's really cool is that the way that the story of 1001 Arabian Nights plays into this is that in order for her to live through the next morning, she starts telling the king Khalid stories that basically go through the entire night up until dawn, giving her a chance to actually like skirt around this curse, because she thinks that if she can entice him enough, maybe he won't kill her, kind of thing. So I found it to be very interesting. I did think though at some points, like, I just thought the story dragged a little bit. I liked the ending scene of it because there's a lot that has to do with Shahrazad's family and the people she comes from, the tribe she comes from, who essentially are trying to rescue her because they think that she's gone off and done something really stupid. I just really like that element of it, and how toward the end of the story we got to really see a lot of like how they were going to impact the story, the family and the friends that were trying to save Shahrazad because they don't believe that she deserves to go through this entire thing by herself. And I just really liked a lot of how this story also showed growth with characters. I felt like the characters did grow quite a bit. Khalid especially, I feel like he definitely opened up a little bit more, and I am very interested to see how the second book, The Rose and the Dagger, goes, because the end of this one makes me think that there's some nefarious things happening that might not be good. The next book I read was The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Luis Zafran. This was an audiobook that I picked up over the course of the month of August, and I actually really liked this one. This was actually my only 5-star read for the entirety of August, and what I loved so much about it, I think, was it kind of gave me the same feelings I got when I read The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt, which were things that, like, I was intrigued, I was questioning things as things were happening, and I felt like the story itself, while it was very slow paced, was slow paced in the sense that, like, it just let the story develop naturally. It felt a very organic pace for the story. It felt like everything was happening the way it was supposed to, and I don't know, I just fell in love with the story. I fell in love with the idea of this library of lost texts that were brought up, because the whole story follows a boy who essentially, his father starts working in this library where a lot of these lost texts end up, or texts that are considered like that need to be protected. They're gonna be, you know, burned, or they're basically being like persecuted for whatever reason. And the main character ends up finding this story called The Shadow of the Wind that he reads and falls in love with. And he basically, throughout the entire story, is trying to find out more about the author, because the author seems to have essentially gone missing and nobody knows anything about him. And it's a story of mystery, of love, of loss, of grief. It is just all of these wonderful things put together that I, just fell in love with every time I put headphones on to listen to this. I just loved every single part of it. And there was music that would play throughout it in the beginning and endings of chapters and in transitions between chapters. It just was such a great reading experience for me. And I highly recommend it to a lot of you who are looking for kind of that almost literary fiction, but has a weird kind of almost like supernatural feel to it. It's not necessarily supernatural at all, but it does have some kind of interesting, like almost magical, realistic kind of idea. This story is just so good. It is so heartwarming, and it is something that I think you keep turning the page with because you want to know more about this author in particular. And like I said, if you like The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt and the pacing of that story, I think you would definitely like the pacing of The Shadow of the Wind, because I felt like they were very similar in their pacing and the organic building of the story. Then my biggest achievement for the month of August was reading The Stand by Stephen King, extended and uncut edition. This book is like 1,200 pages long, and I ended up finally finishing it over the course of August. It almost took me the entire month to do it, but I did it, and I was so proud of myself. And I actually ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars because I really enjoyed it, but I did see a lot of the areas where I think that the original story had been cut, and I thought that it was definitely needed, and I just felt like a lot of places really dragged in the story, which were probably places that were completely cut from the original story. This is basically like everything Stephen King originally had wanted in The Stand before it was originally published, and I do have a reading vlog review of this in the description and in the cards that I will leave for you to watch, because those have basically my more in-depth thoughts thoughts of like towards like I think the second half of the book, because I think that was when I had originally decided to start doing the reading vlog reviews, but will leave that video to you guys to go watch on your own. And then the last book I ended up reading in August was The Water Dancer by Nebuly Coat. I can't remember how to pronounce their first name, but this is something that I think I would recommend to a lot of people who read Colson Whitehead, because it is very similar in the whole construction of the story. It is similar in the kind of almost paranormal, supernatural elements that kind of play into the story like Colson Whitehead does with Underground Railroad in particular. I don't quite know the phrase that you would use to describe this, because magical realism is, I don't think, the proper phrasing to use for this, because it's written by an African-American author, not a Hispanic or Latinx author. I just don't know quite the right way to go about talking about this, because it doesn't necessarily have a lot of paranormal elements. There is kind of almost this paranormal event that happens throughout many times in the book that I think could be classified possibly as like almost sci-fi, but not quite. Like, I don't know how to talk about it, so let me just try to go through the synopsis with you. The Water Dancer is about this slave in the 1800s, basically, in America. You find out he's a child of a plantation owner who is white and a slave who is black, and his mother had died many years prior, and he's kind of lost, and he basically ends up going through this very traumatic event where his half-brother, who is fully white, ends up accidentally drowning in this river. And other than drowning himself, the main character actually ends up saving himself by going through this weird, almost fold-like traversing of the world, because basically he almost in a sense like saves himself by almost teleporting himself away from the water, which he doesn't know really what that's about. And the story is basically following him as he learns more about this ability that he has, and he gets involved in like the Underground Railroad and helping slaves moving from their plantations up to the north and things of that nature. And he even gets to see a little bit of how the North is doing in terms of the slaves, how they're reacting to the former slaves coming up to the north and all these different things. This is a really hard story to talk about, because I also feel like it's been so long since I've read it that I'm forgetting a lot of things, but that's not because the story was bad by any means. I just apparently have awful memory right now. I just cannot for the life of me for these books from August remember very much of the books, and I apologize for that. I will say I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. I don't know if that really accounts for much, but I truthfully cannot remember much of this book without having to look it up, and I just feel like I just really liked it when I listened to it. I thought it was fun. I will say the language was a little hard to follow at times. I feel like this was definitely a book I should have read physically as opposed to the audiobook, because I feel like just the way that the story was written was definitely meant to be read as opposed to spoken out loud. So those are all the books I read in August. So now let's move on to the books I read in September, which I hopefully will have a little bit better recollection than I have for the ones in August. So September was the month of the book-oplathon, which I was really excited to do. I was so motivated to go through it. And then I hit a bit of almost a reading slump, which I have a whole reading vlog that you guys will have seen by this point that I kind of talk about, and how I basically decided to change my mind about a lot of things that I am currently reading, and basically how I plan on going from here when it comes to doing my reading, and whether or not I'm going to be partaking in readathons anymore, because truthfully I feel like I've just burned myself out with readathons. I feel like I no longer find them fun, and I feel like they're way too much pressure. If you want to know more about that, watch that video down in the description and in the cards. But in the month of September, I read 7 books, and I had a page count of 2,515 pages, and then listened to only 10 hours, 15 minutes, and 47 seconds worth of audiobooks. I had 5 physical books that I read, 1 ebook, and 1 audiobook, and 6 of the books that I read were from my personal library, and 1 book was borrowed. The star ratings for the month were that I had 1 5-star book, 3 4-star books, 2 3-star books, 1 2.5-star book, 0 2-star books, 0 1-star books, and 2 books I ended up DNFing. It wasn't like an awful month by any means, but I definitely struggled, I think, toward the second half of the month more so than anything, because I think I just got burned out. But let's get into the books that I read. So the first one I finished was Opposite of Always by Justin A. Reynolds. This was actually a gift that I had got from my friend Adri for my birthday this past July, and I loved this book so much. I started off the month so strong with this one, because this is a YA contemporary that has a little bit of a sci-fi maybe-ishness, because it deals with having to go through the same day over and over again. I don't know if it necessarily would be sci-fi, but it's kind of like you have a Groundhog Day situation where the main character, whose name is Jack, who is a high school senior getting ready to graduate, and he goes to a college party at a college that is about 2 hours away from where he lives, and he meets this girl that goes there named Kate, and he is head over heels in love with her. He falls in love with her after talking with her the entire night of that party. And previously, before that, we learned that he had basically been in love with his best friend for years, but she's been dating their other friend, and he never wanted to kind of step over that boundary because he thought that it wasn't the right thing to do. And then when he meets Kate, everything kind of flows out the window because Kate becomes the center of his world, and they have a very nice, beautiful relationship for a couple of months before, unfortunately, Kate passes away. And essentially the story starts off where we see this very intense scene of Jack having to run to the hospital in order to see Kate, and then we jump back to when they first meet, and essentially from there learn about exactly what happened and how exactly Jack has started to go through this whole Groundhog Day situation where he keeps living the same day over and over again, meeting Kate over and over again, and trying to see if there's a way for him to be able to save her now that he knows that essentially she does end up passing away. It almost is kind of like that second, third, fourth chance romance kind of thing, because he feels like if he does something to possibly change the outcome of Kate's sickness, that they will end up actually being together and having a wonderful life together. The boy is absolutely in love with her, and she really seems to care about him in a lot of ways too. I found this story to be so incredibly sweet. It was such a heartwarming story. It was sad, it was funny, it was cute. Like, I felt every emotion under the rainbow when it came to this story, and I actually cried several times throughout this because of how amazing the story was. It was fun, it was heartbreaking, like everything you would want in like a YA contemporary that actually feels like it's a real thing. That's what I got from this. It is so freaking adorable, and it does have two Black main characters. Is an own voices novel for the race representation. It is just absolutely amazing, and I think this is definitely one I will reread. This would definitely, I think, be a comfort read for me, which is very strange. I don't feel like I have very many comfort reads anymore. There's certain series I think I definitely would put that under, like with Harry Potter and Beautiful Creatures and Morganville Vampires, but this is the only YA contemporary standalone that I would consider to be a comfort read, which is very strange for me considering my other rereads. The next book I completed was the audiobook for The Tattooist of Auchwitz. This was the only audiobook I listened to in the entirety of the month, and truthfully, this was actually fairly good. I really liked it a lot because it deals with a man who is Jewish. He's sent to the concentration camps during World War II, and he becomes a tattooist where he is the one that basically tattoos all of the number codes on each of the prisoners in the camp. And he meets a woman there, and they fall in love very easily, and it's all about them trying to figure out how to escape. It's a story about hope and love and persevering despite the odds and adversity and all these different wonderful things. And I really felt like I loved it so much. What's really interesting too is that this is actually based on somebody's actual accounts of what happened during their time in the concentration camps. Heather Morris at the very end of the book does indicate that this story is based in actual fact because she did meet somebody in Australia who was living there at the time, was a former prisoner there who wanted to tell his story before he passed away. Heather Morris basically wrote everything down, and she did fictionalize it in a sense, like most stories that are based on true stories, and I found it to be much more endearing knowing that it was actually based on somebody's real life. And there even was something written by, I think, one of their children about what exactly happened after the concentration camp was destroyed. One thing I will say is I feel like while I was reading the fictionalized story, that the relationship between the prisoners that fell in love in the story was very quick. It was very insta-lovey. But looking back on it now, knowing that it was based on a true story, I can understand that because it's not necessarily insta-love, but like they were probably very instantly attracted, and because they were in a situation where they didn't know if they were going to be living or dying the next day, that they kind of just very quickly got together because it was like not necessarily desperation. They wanted to spend time with somebody that they, you know, could see themselves spending their last day with, kind of thing. So I thought that was a little bit different than what I had originally thought, but I still, for some reason, there were just some things I think with the pacing and how quick it was that I felt like the story could have just extended a little more. Like, I truthfully think that, like, the end of the story could have been knowing what exactly happened to them in a fictionalized sense after they left the concentration camps, as opposed to their children talking about it, but you know, whatever, it worked. Then the next book I completed was The Woman in the Window by AJ Finn. Now, I actually tried listening to the audiobook of this back in November of 2019, and that was a month where I could not for the life of me get involved with audiobooks. I don't know what it was. It was just a bad month for audiobooks for me that month, and this was unfortunately one of the books I ended up having to DNF at that time because I just couldn't grasp it. But boy, oh freaking boy, did I enjoy this now reading it physically. I loved this book so much. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars because I felt like the end was just a little bit, I don't know, there wasn't, nothing really happened at the very end of the book. Like, I felt like the story could have ended at like the big climax and then that would be it. The ending just did not make me happy. I felt like we could have ended the story like immediately after the climax, and there was this epilogue that I felt like didn't really need to be there. I felt like it was unnecessary, but it was still a really good book, which for those of you that don't know, this is about a woman who is a former child therapist that essentially becomes agoraphobic after this really bad accident she gets in, and the story kind of is trying to partially find out what exactly happened in that accident that led her to become agoraphobic. And then at the same time, there is this family that moves down the street from her, and she's kind of this peeping Tom of sorts where she kind of spies on all her neighbors because she can't like actually interact with them very well. And she meets this woman, Jane Russell. She becomes very, you know, close with her very quickly, and she meets the son, and then unfortunately from her window she sees Jane Russell be killed by somebody. She thinks the husband of the family, and when she calls the police to report the crime, she finds out that there's a woman that is claiming to be Jane Russell who she does not believe is Jane Russell. So there's a lot of like things going on that she doesn't really seem to know about. Like, she doesn't understand what's happening. She feels like she might be going crazy. She's a massive alcoholic and a pill popper, so please keep that in mind. The pills are supposed to be for her mental illness, but she uses them poorly. She basically does not use her medication in the way she's supposed to, and she mixes them with alcohol. So go into the story knowing that. This is one of those stories where I felt like I just really enjoyed it because I never knew what was going to happen next. I felt like I was on my toes the entire time because I wanted to know what was going to happen, and it felt like everything that I thought was going to happen, there was a complete 180 where it completely changed it, and I truly enjoyed that. I love when thrillers do that because it always makes me feel more intrigued and always makes me more interested in finding out the end of the story. And I will say the end of the story was good, but like I said, there's an epilogue that I feel like was completely unnecessary, that I feel like just ruined the whole ending of the book for me. Truthfully, I feel like it just did not work. So then the next book that I actually ended up DNFing this month was Cardmaster by Hana Yakao. This is a manga. It's a standalone manga that I think has something to do with a guy who reads tarot cards and there's supernatural things in it. This was my library lottery pick for September. I couldn't get it. I really didn't like it. I just found it boring. I didn't like anything about it, and I could not understand what the hell was going on because I don't know if this is a traditional way that manga goes. I feel like graphic novels have a bit of a better break between like scenes of things happening and like switches between character points. But this manga, like, it felt like everything was happening at once, and I didn't feel like I ever got like a break between the switches with characters and that way helping to build the story more. Everything just felt like it was all flowing together at once, and I could not for the life of me understand it. So I don't know if that's the way traditional manga is supposed to go, but I really hope not, because if so, then I will never be able to read manga effectively, which will make me very sad because there's a lot of manga I actually really would like to read. And I actually ended up reading an arc of Poems for the End of the World by Katie Weismer. I was very lucky enough to obtain this arc from Katie through her website, and I really liked this. This was my first thing I've ever read by Katie, and it makes me really excited to read her first poetry collection, which I ended up purchasing here not too long ago, which is The Sweetest Kind of Poison, and then read her full-length novel, The Anti-Virginity Pact. This is a collection of poems that basically talk about a lot of things: toxic relationships, emotional abuse, eating disorders, depression, anxiety, like everything bad is packed into this collection because it explores all these different things. And truthfully, it was really strange. It almost felt very comforting because I think that just reading something about somebody telling you that you felt like you were alone about. I really just felt like I wasn't alone with a lot of these poems that this collection had. Now, I couldn't relate to all of it, but there was quite a bit of it where I felt like I did, and I highlighted so many poems in this collection. Like, it was so awesome to see how many of these poems I really felt like I connected with. The one thing I will say, and it was the reason I only gave it a 4 out of 5 stars as opposed to a 5, is the fact that I think a personal thing for me is that I like it when poems kind of have a story almost created with them, and I feel like this collection didn't have that. I felt like everything was very scattered. I felt like poems were in one area that should have all been in a different area together. I just in particular didn't care for the structure of it, but that was a personal thing for me. I'm sure there are plenty of people who would enjoy the way the poem collection was structured, and it could just be me that has the issue with it, and that's totally fine. And the next book I ended up reading was The Savage Song by Victoria Schwab. This was kind of surprising in terms of how I felt about it, because I thought it was going to be just a 4-star book. It ended up being a 3-star, and it wasn't bad by any means, but I just don't think I was really blown away by it, and I felt like, I don't know, I just felt like it didn't live up necessarily to the hype I had been giving it, but I did enjoy it enough to where I definitely immediately purchased Our Dark Duet, because I do want to know what happens in this story. This is a book that deals with 2 main characters in this kind of dystopian world that also deals with supernatural elements. We have one main character who is named Kate, I believe. Yeah, Kate Harker, and she is the daughter of basically like the governor or mayor or leader of this portion of this dystopian world, and she's bounced around from place to place, boarding school to boarding school, because her father does not want to seem to take care of her for one reason or another, and she keeps doing things to try to get his attention. And so then she ends up going back to where her home is and finds out that there are some pretty nefarious things happening in terms of what her father is doing in this town, and it's entirely possible that she could be in some pretty significant danger if she's not careful. Throughout the story, she meets another character who we also see the perspective of, named August Flynn, who is basically a demon, and his whole storyline is that he's a type of demon called a Sunai, who essentially, in order to feed on other people, they use music, and they only feed off of what are considered sinners, so people who've done really bad things and they're looking to repent in a sense, or maybe not necessarily looking to repent, but they're forced to repent when they hear August's music, because essentially it draws out their sinful energy and he eats that, and then the person becomes like a corpse basically. All of the demons are considered bad, but I feel like the Sunai are definitely the least bad out of all. And what's interesting is, like, in this dystopian world, there is a war going on between the demons and the humans, and you learn more about that as the story goes. And August is kind of caught in the middle because he thinks that a lot of what is the demons are planning to do in terms of this rebellion that they're planning is not the way to go, and so he kind of sides with the humans in some ways about how destructive the demons can be, but he also is a demon himself. And so what they end up doing is, the demon side of this whole world, they send August in to spy on Kate while she's in school so that they can try to possibly use her as leverage for their rebellion. And August, unfortunately though, he finds that he does care for her. Like, it's not necessarily a story where like romance is a big thing, but there is kind of some possible romantic tension between the two, but I feel like the story doesn't focus on that nearly as much. I think that that was what I was missing for some reason, and I think that's because a lot of people that I remember hearing talk about this said that there was a big romance thing, and I didn't see it. I just saw Kate and August, who were both kind of fighting for the same thing. They may have like attraction to each other, but that was basically it. Like, there was no actual romance happening in the story, and I feel like that kind of let me down because I had that expectation, but it's not necessarily a bad thing that it wasn't there. It wasn't there. I think my big gripes with this though were like, I just felt like Kate was way too strong. Like, I felt like for some reason I felt like Kate was trying to be somebody she's not. I feel like that's the whole point of her character, is she tries to be somebody she's not in order to get attention from her father, and I couldn't believe it. I could not suspend my disbelief enough to think that that's who she is, and I kind of was disappointed in that because I typically love strong female characters, but I feel like Kate was a big softie and just should have been a big softie that then grew to be strong, as opposed to thinking that she's super strong and proving to be not that at all. I don't know, I just felt like this didn't live up to the expectations I had for it when I went into it. So it was fine though. I really did like it in a lot of ways. I liked the world. I liked the war that's going on. I like August and Kate individual as characters. I just didn't live up to what I expected, so I gave it a 3 stars. The next 2 books that I read, I do have reading vlog reviews for that I will leave down in the description, but that is for Black Blood and Red Dice, books 2 and 3 in the Thirst series by Christopher Pike. I will say I feel like the series has gone on a bit of an upswing with these 2 books because I rated the first book, The Last Vampire, 2 stars, then Black Blood I rated a 2.5 stars, and then Red Dice I rated a 3 stars. So there does seem to be some interesting development with this story to where I think that it's starting to get better, but I will leave those 2 videos for you guys to go watch when you would like to, if you want to hear my more in-depth thoughts on these 2 books. And finally, the last book that I DNF'd that I think nearly put me into a reading slump. It didn't quite do it, but it almost did, was Lovely War by Julie Berry. I had such high expectations for this one. I thought I was going to love this book with the fact that I knew it had to do with the gods and goddesses from Greek mythology, and it had to do with World War I and World War II, and it was going to be romantic. I didn't like it. I really didn't. I got like almost 150 pages in to the book and I could not take anymore. I felt like it was a drag to try and go back to this book time and time again because I just was no longer interested in it. The story is supposed to follow 2 sets of couples that the goddess Aphrodite talks about in the story. Like, she is retelling their story and how she brought them together and how war essentially has torn them apart or something like that. But truthfully, for the first 100, almost 150 pages, we only see one couple, and that's Hazel and James, and I fell in love with them. I loved them so much. They were so sweet and so endearing. And then we got to the other characters and I was like, I just want to hear about Hazel and James. I don't want to hear about this other couple. I don't give a shit about them. Like, all I want is my Hazel and James. That's it. And I feel like I just, at that point, just lost complete interest in the story, and I could not bring myself to go back to this book. The more I tried to, the less I wanted to read, and it nearly put me in a reading slump because of that. I will say that one thing I did like was that another character, Aubrey, there's a lot that's talked about with him and the fact that he's a Black musician, and how there's a lot of talk about how Black people are viewed in this story and how they're viewed in this time period, and I really did appreciate that. But that did not leave enough for me to really continue going back to the story. It just did. Those are all the books that I read in September and then also in August of 2020. So October, I'm not going to be filming a TBR video because it is literally going to be a month where I just read whatever the hell I want. I am not stressing myself out because the next couple months are still going to be pretty crazy with getting married at the end of the month, and then in November going on my honeymoon and dealing with like Thanksgiving and Black Friday and all these things. Anyway, let me know what you guys ended up reading both in August and September down in the comments below. Did you read any of these books that I picked up in the month? But anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me in this video. If you guys did enjoy it, please do give it a big thumbs up. And if you're not already and you'd like to be, hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye, guys.